The Last Brother, a Civil War Tale, written by Trinka Hakes Noble, illustrated by Robert Papp. On the morning of July 1st, 1863, the peaceful little town of Gettysburg awoke early as usual. Front porches were swept clean, feather beds aired, and blackberry jam bubbled on the stove. In the town square, old men dozed in the shade while small barefoot boys scampered towards Seminary Ridge carrying fishing poles and berry pails. 1 mile across from Seminary Ridge rose Cemetery Ridge, flanked by Little Round Top and Big Round Top, the south, and Cemetery and Culp's Hill to the north. In the rich valley below, tidy farms and fields spread out like a patchwork quilt stitched together with split rail fences. Yet the Civil War had raged for 2 years. Gettysburg was only 7 miles from Mason-Dixon line. When rumors reached the old men that Confederate troops had pushed north into Pennsylvania, they kept a watchful lookout for signs of war. But the barefoot boys up on Seminary Ridge saw it first, two massive clouds of dust gathering on either horizon as two armies moved closer. In one cloud of dust marched a young boy in a blue uniform with a full knapsack, a canteen, and a brass bugle slung over his shoulder. His name was Gabriel, and he was a bugler in the Union Army, even though he was only 11. Gabe was the youngest in a big Pennsylvania farm family of 4 boys and 5 girls. He'd run away with his brother Davy, who was 16, to join up. When the recruiting officer asked Davy his age, Davy honestly replied, "I'm over 18," because he had slipped a piece of paper inside his shoe with 18 penciled on it. Then he pointed at Gabe. "Think you can blow a bugle from the Keystone State, boy?" Gabriel nodded. "I can learn, sir." Lots of boys Davy's age got the war fever, hankering for adventure and glory, but Gabe had his own reason for taking after Davy. Joshua and Tucker, Gabe's 2 oldest brothers, had marched off to join the Union Army when President Lincoln first called for volunteers after the firing on Fort Sumter in 1861. "It's just for 90 days, Josh and Tuck assured their ma and pa. Come harvest time, we'll be back. Can't expect these 2 little runts to handle it," they joked, playfully cuffing Davy and Gabe. But ma and pa looked serious. "You are the sons of old Pennsylvania now," they said. How proudly Josh and Tuck marched off in their blue uniforms. Dave and Gabe had raced alongside, shouting, "The Union forever!" while their sisters cheered, waving with white handkerchiefs. But harvest time came and went. 90 days stretched into a year, then 2, until finally one day the sad news came, and those 90 days had become forever. That's when Gabe knew Davy would enlist and he would follow. So now Gabe and Davy were the boys in blue. Gabe pulled his cap low and squinted. He searched for Davy marching with the 71st Pennsylvania, but the dust was too thick. So many regiments and brigades had joined the long blue column, with flags flying from every northern state from Maine to Michigan to Minnesota. Gabe had never seen so many soldiers. "Keep up, boy," ordered a sergeant. "No stragglers. We got a full day's march to Gettysburg." "Yes, sir," Gabe obeyed, and quick stepped forward, keeping his eye on Lancer up ahead, the major's powerful chestnut charger. Lancer was a trained military horse with the letters U.S. branded on his hindquarter. Neither busting shells nor flying bullets spooked him. He'd charged into battle, knowing all the commands almost before they were called. Like Lancer, Gabe knew all the commands too. There were over 60 different battle calls for young buglers to learn. The problem in the Civil War was that the Confederate Army had the same calls, so it was crucial for troops to learn the style of their own bugler, especially in battle. So Gabriel practiced long and hard, and to make sure his regiment knew it was him, he put a little uplifting lift in each one. But unlike Lancer, Gabe had never been in a real battle. Next day they made camp below Cemetery Ridge. Already fighting and skirmishes had broken out. Cannon smoke hung heavy in the air. Up on Cemetery Hill, Gabe could see dozens of artillery batteries pointed toward the enemy. Immediately the major called for scouts, and Davy was the first to step forward. Gabe nervously watched his brother vanish into the smoke while army mules rumbled by hauling more cannons and heavy caissons loaded with grape shot and canister shells. Gabe knew he wouldn't be needed right away, so he slipped into the densely wooded hillside and sat by a stream to practice battle calls. He stuffed his handkerchief in his bugle's bell and softly blew, "Commence fire." To his surprise, a bugle softly answered from across the stream with "Cease fire." Gabe looked but saw no one, so he blew "Fix bayonets," and instantly heard "Unfix bayonets." Astounded, Gabe stood and blew a few charge, and back came retreat. Suddenly a boy peeked out from the bushes with a bugle in one hand, a fishing pole in the other, and a big old grin on his dirty freckled face. He splashed across the stream to Gabe. "Howdy, I'm Orley. You sure know how to blow that horn." "I'm Gabriel." Gabe smiled, happy to meet a boy his own age. Orley started gabbing like they were old friends. "Gabriel, now, that's a right fancy name. My pa wanted to give me a fancy name, but Ma wanted to call me Lee. Pa kept thinking up fancier and fancier names like Beauregard and Bertram, but Ma kept saying, 'Orley?' She had to say it so many times that pretty soon they just called me Orley." Gabe laughed and Orley chuckled. It'd been a long time since either boy had laughed. "Betcha thought I was named after General Robert Lee, didn't ya?" Orley winked. "Nah, not in Mississippi Hills I growed up in. Ma figured a name like Lee was with just 3 letters, especially with 2 of them the same, would be easier for a feller to keep track of. A right smart woman, my ma." Then Orley paused and quietly asked, "Do your home folks call you Gabe?" Gabe nodded silently, and for a moment both boys tried to remember the sound of their mothers' voices. That's when Gabe noticed Orley had scratched his name and regiment, the 11th Mississippi, on the bell of his bugle, just in case. But Orley wasn't silent for long. "I was sneaking in a little fishin'," he teased, "and you come by and blew 'Commence fire,' and those fish skedaddled faster than fat hens on market day. But they're hiding right under the fallen log," Gabe grinned, remembering the best place to catch brook trout back home was under the covered bridge. The 2 boys sat down to fish. Soon Orley asked, "Got anything to trade?" Gabe swapped some army hardtack for a bit of Orley's fatback. Then Orley handed Gabe some Virginia pipe tobacco and said, "Don't smoke it. It's like gold. You can trade tobacco for anything." So Gabe gave Orley his ration of coffee, and they divided the fish. As they departed, the 2 young buglers played taps to each other as a way of saying farewell. Gabe couldn't help but notice a sad downturn in his friend's bugle call, and it worried him. But for a short time the old hills of Pennsylvania shielded the northern boy and the southern lad from what was to come. When Gabe got back to camp, Davy hadn't returned, but there were other duties for a bugle boy to perform, so Gabe carried firewood, filled canteens, and watered the major's horse. While Lancer drank, Gabe leaned into his side and lightly traced a long, jagged scar across the horse's broad chest. "Lancer," he whispered, "I wish you could tell me what it's like to be in battle." When Gabe thought about Josh and Tuck, he wanted to cry. Now Davy was in the fight. What if Davy didn't come back like Josh and Tuck? For a moment Gabe buried his face in Lancer's mane as the great horse gently wrapped his powerful neck and head around the boy. Suddenly Lancer whinnied low. Gabe jerked around. There stood Orley, solemn, in full uniform, his finger pressed against his lips. "Gabe," he whispered seriously, "we got battle orders. My whole regiment's assembled just yonder." Then he silently waved the back of his hand at Gabe. "Best hightail it out of here with that horse before they see you." Gabe grabbed Lancer's reins, shot a nervous glance toward the clearing, and silently mouthed the words, "Thank you," as he pulled Lancer around. "Gabe," Orley softly called after him, "if you ever get to Mississippi some day." Gabe nodded over his shoulder. "God willing, we'll fish again if—" But Orley had already vanished. Gabe hurried Lancer out of sight. It was long after dark before Davy returned, exhausted, his face streaked with gunpowder and sweat. He wolfed down the fish stew Gabe had saved for him, drained a fresh canteen, and sprawled on the ground until he caught his breath. "We fought the Rebs in the woods today," he said hoarsely, his eyes closed. "Gabe, some of them aren't any older than me." Gabe nodded, but didn't tell Davy about Orley. The Confederates are all over that far ridge down near Little Round Top, too, Davy reported. They captured the town, got sharpshooters in the church towers. Folks are hiding in their cellars. Almost took Culp's Hill. Gabe was nearly outflanked. See those campfires along Cemetery Ridge? Well, some of them are fake. Kept going by a couple picket guards, trying to fool the Confederates into thinking we've got more men. Davy stood, anxious to clean and reload his rifle, then paused. Get some sleep, little brother. We'll see heavy action tomorrow. Gabe could see the burning embers reflected in Davy's eyes. Gabe, he said lowly, all the Pennsylvania boys volunteered to go first, so stay on the safe side of the Major's horse tomorrow. Then he was gone. All through the night the Union campfires burned on Cemetery Ridge, but Gabe couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Davy and Orley, afraid of what might happen tomorrow. When he peeked from his bedroll, the flickering firelight cast ominous shadows of troops digging defensive earthworks, mules hauling heavy supply wagons, and reinforcements creeping in under the cover of darkness. At dawn, the campfires blinked out one by one. When Gabe sounded revel for his regiment, scores of other regiment buglers echoed up and down the ridge. There, concealed just below Cemetery Ridge, was the whole Union army, entrenched, ready, and waiting. That morning, Gabe's regiment could hear heavy gunfire as they marched into position on the north section of Cemetery Ridge behind the gunners. Gabe stood next to Lancer at his post, bugle in hand. Davy waited in front line, his rifle loaded at the ready. Then, at midday, from across the valley, Confederate cannons opened fire and Union cannons roared back with the thundering blast that shook the earth. Shells exploded everywhere. The deafening blast knocked Gabe off balance. He grabbed onto Lancer. "Hold steady, boys," shouted the major. "They can't dislodge the old Keystone." The Union artillery gunners were relentless, firing volley after volley. Gunpowder smoke burned Gabe's eyes, choked his throat, and scorched his lungs. The Confederate cannon stubbornly pounded back, ripping into the Union lines. With each blast, blinding dirt, sizzling shell fragments, and lead grape shot hissed helter-skelter through the ranks. The massive bombardment kept up non-stop from both sides for 2 deadly hours, but the Keystone held. The suffocating smoke cleared. Gabe stiffened with fear at what he saw, for there, pouring out from behind the trees of Cemetery Ridge, was thousands upon thousands of Confederate troops advancing across the valley. What had once been a patchwork quilt of tidy farms and fields was now a swarming mass of soldiers in gray charging toward the Union lines. Chills shot up Gabe's spine. Lancer's head jerked violently, his ears flattened. "Forward!" ordered the major as the first bullets whizzed overhead. Somehow Gabe blew "Forward!" and the 71st Infantry moved in front, and the field guns and cannons like a precision machine, and took cover behind a stone wall. "Ready on firing line! Commence fire!" Gabe could barely breathe, but sounded the command, and a storm of bullets smashed into the Confederate lines. "Fire at will! Fire at will! Fire at will!" was shouted up and down the Union lines. Gabe shook, yet stayed on his feet. Blood streamed down Lancer's leg. Davy blurred into a solid fortress of blue, firing and reloading, firing and reloading, firing and reloading. But still the Confederates kept coming, firing back, determined to break the Union lines. The gunfire from both sides was so intense, so thick, that some Union and Confederate bullets actually collided in midair and fell to the ground, but many hit their mark until both sides had nearly exhausted their ammo.